joining us this morning. Obviously, we've got a mix of the panel here. Really want to have a robust discussion, particularly reflecting on the last sort of 3 years of the regulatory changes, the experiences the industry has felt, and sort of the opportunities which the Minister has touched on. So very pleased to be joined here by Helen Skinner, obviously Head of Responsible Investments at ANZ, Alec, Tang, Partner for Sustainable Value at KPMG, and April Mackenzie, Chief Executive of the External Reporting Board, and of course, Minister Watts. So obviously, Minister, I thought you touched on it well. I think this is obviously an important topic for all of us as the industry, and I want to thank everybody for joining us and what promises to be hopefully a robust discussion. Encourage the panellists to engage with each other on the challenges and opportunities that arise from climate-related disclosures going forward. You touched on it well, which is the financial services sector. Obviously, we excel at assessing risk and maximising opportunities, and so we are acutely aware of sort of the increasing challenges that come from climate change, both to our society and also in the management of financial assets and risk management. And globally, this flow of capital will play a crucial role in sort of addressing our goals to mitigate climate change and to adapt. So naturally, though, this process is complex, which many of us have been experiencing over the last few years, and there are going to be a number of learnings that come through this process as we find the best way to execute and strike that balance between ultimately reporting and delivering outcomes. So this morning, we really want to delve into the CRD regime, particularly as we wait on our first set of reports and reflect on sort of the challenges we've faced so far. Naturally, as time goes on, I'd expect that we start to assess the regime and continue to challenge ourselves as to whether we're delivering on those objectives and whether it's creating the value that we need. So is the sector progressing? What role is the regime having? And are we delivering transparent outcomes? And what other roles can we play together around your adaptability bills to deliver on some of the ambitious targets that New Zealand has set? So, Minister, as you'll know, the banking and finance services sector holds over $1 trillion of assets. And as a group, we've touched on the awareness of risks and opportunities. How do you see the sort of sector contributing towards those long-term goals, particularly as you start to progress things like the adaptability bill?
Yeah, well, first, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here alongside colleagues. Look, I think it's it's a significant opportunity. I was in Singapore last week with the IPEF, which is the 14 trade ministers from including US, Australia, and most Southeast Asian countries. What was really clear from the dialogue there, and I was sitting next to the head of BlackRock on one side of me, and then the head of another major fund manager out of the US on the other side, and the opportunity there is the Australians walked up to that event and they had $2.5 trillion worth of investment projects that they were wanting funding for in their country. They had a pitch book, they were well organised, they had a coordinated approach. And I think the challenge is there is a huge amount of capital out there. Capital's not the problem, right? There is a lot of capital out there. The challenge for New Zealand is being able to package up the opportunities that we have at a New Zealand Inc. level in a scale and a mechanism that is attractive to that capital. And also acknowledging that this is a competitive capital environment. There's the Aussies and a huge other number of countries. Most countries have got opportunities as well. And so I think the role that the financial services sector critically can play is actually at that strategic level. We need to be considering what is the buyer wanting, what are the opportunities in terms of that we can package up to sell to that, and therefore how do we make sure that we've got scale of investment opportunities? Because there is a lot of good players in New Zealand, but often the challenges are subscale. They're not of the size and scale that is hitting. BlackRock's a different example, but they're not even interested unless it's $500 million of US. So we've got to just sort of find that opportunity. There's also a huge amount of domestic capital as well flowing around, and I think the opportunity between from central government participating in terms of that structuring of those funding and financing mechanisms to achieve climate resilient investment or emissions reduction investment, such as building a green hydrogen production facility in New Zealand, is actually, so what role can Crown capital play to get the private capital excited as part of the structuring of that capital mix that is available? And again, there is different ways to achieve that, but the fact that the Crown takes out some degree of participation and risk does therefore reduce that risk consideration from the private capital to potentially bring it to the table. And I just think we need to get much more commercial actually around how we're thinking about investing this, but at a country Inc. level, because most other countries such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, they don't want to deal with corporate to corporate in New Zealand. They want to deal government to government, even though the government might not be the provider of the packaging of that investment portfolio. But the government or the minister can act as, in effect, a facilitator of that capital flow. And I think we've got some real opportunities in that space. And if we can get that right, we're talking about increased economic growth, we're talking increased productivity, and we're talking about increased jobs, and well-paying, high-value jobs as well. And we've got abundant resources here, abundant natural resources for renewables, and that's our competitive advantage, and we should lean into that. And the sector and the role that you play as part of that is just that facilitation and that strategic oversight to say, actually, how do we solve these complex problems? And we're actually pretty good at solving problems when given this terms of reference and the scope of that. So that would be my advice.
I definitely agree that there is no shortage of capital, and I think the panel here, I'm sure many of us will sit in this room and go, there is a natural desire to want to be investing in these projects and asset opportunities. There is just a trade-off, though, with the work that has to go on with the reporting regime and striking that fine balance. So I think it'll be interesting to see where we go in terms of that adaptation bill and how do we work more proactively together as an industry on actually the outcomes element and the investment element rather than just the reporting element. April, you obviously with the XRB, you've been critical in sort of the rolling out of the reporting standards, and I actually want to acknowledge the work that the XRB has done in terms of engaging with the industry. You've actually been fantastic in terms of, as an organisation, facilitating events and being very transparent in sort of the feedback process. So do you want to give us a little bit of an overview of sort of your insights and learnings of the last few years around the reporting regime?
Kia ora, Dean. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today and to reflect on the journey over the last 3 years. I really appreciate everybody in the room who has engaged with the External Reporting Board. We tackled this project on being responsible for the development of climate standards. We said we need to do this differently from the way that we do accounting standards or assurance standards. And we lent into engagement, being out there and responding and saying yes to every opportunity that was presented to us. The number of speeches, the number of meetings was on a scale that we had never undertaken before, with just a tiny team of people, about half a dozen people, and the fact that you all engaged with us and we got to hear all of the views. And in a very short time frame when it comes to standard setting, there was a sense of urgency about the process. So what we ended up doing was, based on TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that you're all familiar with, although we don't use that terminology anymore. It seems to slowly be disappearing, but we based our standards on the TCFD. And the first interesting challenge is when you move from a voluntary regime to a mandatory regime. There's no underestimating the pain point around that move when all of a sudden directors and management need to ponder the consequences more closely about what they're reporting and are they meeting the mark. So we based our standards on TCFD, which many in this room were already familiar with, but trying to work through that documentation, which ran for pages, to make a mandatory regime was a challenge. We went the principles-based route. There's a big sliding scale in standard setting from rules-based to principles-based. Now, the rules are usually based on principles, but the descriptor is very specific disclosure requirements through to more of an articulation around the objective of the disclosure. And we landed more towards the objective statement. This is what you're trying to achieve with the disclosure. Therefore, think about it. Pain. How do we do this? What do we have to disclose? How do we disclose it? And we were suddenly realising, and I think you've all realised in the room, that we really hadn't been really thinking about the risks and opportunities. There'd been a higher level consideration of climate change reporting. So through that engagement and going that more principles-based way, I think we've not made it easy. I know that, and I acknowledge that. And I think at one level, a rules-based system is easier. Just tick this box, fill this number in. But we were, from listening to those committed to the cause of bringing about real movement in New Zealand to a low emissions, climate resilient economy, that they said we've really got to engage with the problem, engage with the opportunities, and therefore this objective principles-based approach, whilst I think you're all going through the pain now, has hopefully not focused on the reporting, but focused on the process and engaging with your board of directors, thinking about the things that the minister's referring to, about how do we package this up, what are the opportunities that we can also communicate. So I'll stop there. I could chatter on for a long time, except just to say one thing. There's a lot of noise about internationalisation and harmonisation. We're not going to do that in a hurry. We're going to give you a stable regulatory platform. NZCS, New Zealand Climate Standards, are what you are legally obliged to follow in New Zealand now. We will undertake a review in 2025. We're committed to that, and maybe I'll talk to that later. But be careful what you wish for. The international sustainability standard, it might be easier in that it's much more tick box. It's got about 50 more disclosures than we have, but we're not convinced it will give the same result. We're not convinced it will bring the outcomes that we're looking for, that move to that low emissions, climate resilient economy. I think what it would be is only a reporting regime.
Sorry, you get,
I was just going to say, on the international element, I would love to be a person who doesn't have to worry about that, because I'm likely to be captured by the Australian regulations. So I'm not sure we'll have a choice, in particular for those that are internationally based. Yeah, that's just one of those pain points. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in, April, on your point about erring away from tick box. And I think it's really critical that we go back to why are we doing this? It goes back to the minister's point about capital. Like, this isn't about creating a great report, fundamentally, sorry.
No, it's not.
But it is about how does this help move that capital in places where it needs to go. And it needs to be tricky and it needs to be challenging. And we'll go to scenario thinking a little bit. But we are great. Humans are great at confirmation bias, right? And if we didn't have this challenge and if we didn't genuinely engage, we would probably just trot out the same kinds of risks or opportunities that we've been thinking about previously. And we know that that's not going to work. We know that we have to do things differently. So it is challenging, but if we do it as a tick box, we're going to miss some of those broader insights. We're not going to get that transformation that we know we need to do, and we're not going to see the world differently. And we'll talk a bit about scenarios later, but fundamentally, they are about broadening our field of view. We have a whole bunch of mental models that we sit on, and we make decisions based on that. And the purpose of scenarios is to really open that out and go, well, actually, that future, who would have imagined 5-6 years ago that we would have gone through a pandemic, that we would see the kinds of climate impacts that we are seeing already? And that is a really important kind of aha moment that these disclosure processes, put it that way, should be taking us to, right?
Yeah, look, I agree, and I think we've touched on it, Minister touched on it. This is also an economic issue, and there is a particular balance when we're dealing with boards and getting people up to speed on this process, and the timeline has been incredibly tight for the learning curve for a number of parties that are involved in this. Yeah, so the getting the boards up to speed has been, I'm sure, a critical challenge, and the learning curves involved with that. I do still think there is a balance, and we're going to have a number of learnings over the next few years around striking that balance, so between what does the reporting actually tell us, and were we actually already on a pathway where many organisations in this room have been proactively looking at this topic and theme generally. They're responding to consumer demand. They're aware of what consumers are expecting. They're aware of the opportunities and risks. Have we accelerated and have we delivered more outcomes, given the tens of millions that we're probably spending on this regime annually? And those are going to be some of the lessons, and I guess, how do we tweak it? But I'm very conscious that be careful what we wish for, because other regimes. So Helen, maybe do you want to talk about your experience so far? And obviously you are have a broader, larger view of the potential impacts it's going to face you as an organisation.
And you know I'm itching to go on this, so
Yeah.
everyone in the room knows I want to talk about it. The first thing I'd just like to go back to is the Minister's point, because I've sat in a room so often at the moment, and I'm sure many of us have, we're talking about why aren't we investing more in sustainable infrastructure and sustainable private equity, and we are sitting there saying, well, where is the investment for us to do this? And so, great, go for that. Happy to be part of that conversation. But I think with the point of what have we learnt about this, and is it actually making any change? Everyone in this room knows this has been painful. You know, there have been sustainability people around the country, including those at the XRB, who have been looking incredibly frazzled through this period, and I think you said there was a sense of urgency. We have definitely felt that. I think that there are a number of us that were already considering climate change 100%. But what this has done is meant that we have introduced a whole load of structures and processes that are far more robust. And I think it's meant that those that might be champions of change and climate change who already are on the journey had a voice in order for us to be able to speak to others. And for instance, I've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months speaking to directors outside of our organisation, and particularly investee companies, and reminding them that this isn't about those that are captured by the reporting. This is about your access to insurance and bank funding and investor shareholders. And if you are a wholesale fund manager, and you're small, don't think you're not going to be asked these questions out there. We're going to come to you and say, where's your transition plan and what's the scenarios that you're doing and that sort of thing. So it's brought out a really common language across all of us, both here and internationally. And I'm doing a lot of work now with the Australian community and telling them about what we've been through and how they can really come on this journey. So I think from that perspective, it's been really interesting, and particularly at a governance level when we've had those conversations with them, and bringing the learning curve for directors has been immense. And quite often those directors have had to learn and make decisions at the same time, and that is not a comfortable position for any director to be in. So I would say challenging, but we're getting there, yeah.
You mentioned robust. Are they going to be comparable?
I would say, obviously we don't know, we're not there yet, but my gut says it's going to be difficult in year one, because there is a difference in the first year adoption provisions that everyone is picking up. So, some we've chosen to pretty much go with everything as much as we can, as possible. Others I know are taking up as many provisions as they possibly can. So that's going to be quite challenging in the first year. And the other thing is it's going to be challenging across different investment styles as well, and different models. Found that there's such a major difference as to whether it's a model that is completely run through partnerships, and you may be just putting a bit of a wrap around a large global player like a BlackRock, or if you have a domestic element and you're running funds domestically, and also between a passive investment and active investment. So it's going to bring up a lot of the differences that happen in the industry, but we'll see it coming together, I think, as we go through more and more of these things.
Can I comment on that? Don't get hung up on comparability. It's going to take some time, and it will never be as comparable as your financial statement and comparing this performance or this gross margin to the next entity over. That's just one number. In fact, the External Reporting Board has just issued a new accounting standard that's going to make that even more comparable, because we've even gone as far, based on the international standard, to tell you what headings to put on your financial statements. But that's what the International Board is, so that's what's going to happen in New Zealand. So the comparability will come over time, but step one is trend. Comparing an entity year on year. Is it identifying the risk? Is it identifying the opportunities? Is it resilient? Is it attracting that capital to meet those opportunities and make the most of that? And how resilient is that entity? And then we'll see it within an industry, and then it hopefully will emerge. But Helen makes a good point. It's just a different beast, and it's not like comparing a profit return in one space to another.
And just two things on that in terms of comparability. One, the ultimate aim of this in terms of get change, it needs to resonate with the organisation, and every organisation is different. So I think we have to think about comparability of what you disclose on for an investor perspective, and as you said, that will take time. But the process that you go through has to be tailored to your organisation and has to resonate, has to take into consideration the maturity of your directors, your exec, and take them through that process. So what you get out, you may compare, but thinking that there's one approach to doing this is really it goes against what this regime is trying to do, right?
Yeah, I do acknowledge that, but I think there is still going to be that critical element, which is end consumers are going to be seeing information, and media is going to simplify this right down to a very simple bullet point. And naturally, as a result of that, there is going to be comparisons, and it's not going to be possible, but it is going to be made. And how do you deal with that challenge?
But I do also think that there's a really important, so I agree in terms of what may be read into it, but it's inherent in us or practitioners to keep explaining what these are, what are scenarios, what are they not, and how should they be used. And I think there is a massive learning curve, and we have this tendency to oversimplify. This is really complex, as Minister Watts said, and we need to bring people along with us. So yes, there is. But the other thing about media is if there's a vacuum, it will be filled, fundamentally, right?
Yeah, and I think that comes on all of us, and we'd love to get your help with this as well, but is really doing the education, that it's not around just a pure gross emissions number and doing a comparative on that, but it's actually taking people on the journey. And we've talked a lot about capability in New Zealand and financial capability from a consumer perspective, and these need to be consumer friendly, but yeah, the media comes into that in a big way. So.
And that's going to be a challenge, particularly if we think about our sector and the scale differences between organisations. So, you know, this challenge of this regime is obviously it is incredibly onerous, but not everybody. And as a sector as a whole, we have a resourcing constraint on this still. Alec, what have you seen when engaging with organisations on sort of the pathway with this?
The sector piece is really interesting, and I think the position that XRB, or the recommendation about doing sector level starting points has been fantastic, right? From a not just an efficiency perspective and trying to start from the same point, but actually that cross-sector knowledge and sharing and collaboration. And so Minister talked about transport and energy as two key sectors from a decarb perspective. So our Te Reo Circle, we've just been working on the transport sector climate scenarios. At the same time, PwC were working on the energy sector climate scenarios. And what we realised was the two need to come together. So not only have we got intra-sector collaboration within transport, within energy, we have cross-sector collaboration, because that's really important. Again, what are some of the lessons that we're coming out of this disclosure regime is that the solutions that we're talking about aren't just going to sit within one organisation, right? They are going to require us to think differently about value chains, supply chains, work between organisations and across traditional silos of sectors. So I think that has been an amazing kind of efficiency, but also a real great knowledge sharing and ability to kind of cross-fertilise ideas. So that's what we've seen generally. I think as we've seen the first disclosures come through, and as people talk more about, well, what did you find? You know, how did you approach your board? And also that board directors sit on multiple organisations, so they're cross-fertilising. So I guess, you know, we can't ignore that it's been somewhat painful, but it is, learning is painful. So I think it's really important.
Look, I think it opens up an interesting point. I'm so curious to get some insight from yourself, Minister, on that cross-collaboration. Obviously, you know, this touches a number of departments, and interested to understand sort of your day-to-day work with, like, some Minister Bailey on our legislative regime and how we are going to adapt to climate change and make investments in this space. So, do you have some insights on that cross-collaboration?
Well, we're 200 days into the government. I mean, what's good in one way is that many of us around the cabinet table come from commercial and private sector and outside of politics, jobs, which gives us a perspective around actually the fact that silos are a threat, and we need to work collaboratively across portfolios on dealing with complex problems. And so RMA reform's a good example. I sit on a broad ministerial advisory group, which is the Minister of Transport, Climate Change, Environment, Maori Development, Minister Bishop from RMA. We're all around that looking at that problem and considering it from different angles and perspectives. Climate change, I said I chair the Ministerial Climate Change Board, of which all the ministers that have responsibility for implementing transport or energy are reporting into me, but have an overarching strategic framework of how the system needs to coordinate. But also the role that actually government is only one participant at the table and part of that team. Actually, and sometimes the best thing that we can do is get out of the way. Or we can put in regulation or take it away, maybe write some check for a capital, but outside of that, when we're starting to do, our value add dissipates. And I'm not trying to get myself out of a job, but I'm just being realistic of actually, government is only one seat at that table. But in aspects like climate adaptation, where you need leadership to bring those different elements of fragmentation within the broader country or system together, government does need to acknowledge their role in playing that leadership and move at pace to bring that group together, but also know when to get out. And so the same around facilitation, around some of these capital deal conversations at a country-to-country level. The Prime Minister's flying out. We've got the Chinese Premier here tomorrow. I'm in a bilateral with him and the Prime Minister tomorrow morning. The Prime Minister's on a plane on Sunday out to Japan with a business committee of, I think, Antonio from ANZ's on the plane. We've got 20 business leaders there. Japan wants to do a government-to-government negotiation on big deals, and then the deals fall off. So there is a real commercial role for ministers and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is our best salesperson, actually. That's his role when he's on the world stage, is to sell New Zealand Inc. And that's what he'll be doing in Japan, whether he's meeting with the big hydrogen players and trying to work out what those commercial deals that at a structure are, and then hand that over to private sector. I think our challenge is there is a void between the opportunities that overseas buyers want in terms of investment opportunities and the portfolio of opportunities and the way in which that is structured and the maturity of that portfolio in a New Zealand sense. And it's often subscale, probably because we've got a lot of fragmentation. And so actually I think there's a lot more opportunity for more strategic alliances between players in New Zealand around investment opportunities to just sort of work together. And it's not sort of being anti-competitive, it's actually just giving a degree of scale that actually gets you on the radar of those overseas investors, because there are thresholds and the small stuff just won't get up there. But we are the landmass of the United Kingdom. We are blessed with opportunities, as I said. I see, and I genuinely say, while climate change is a threat, it is also a significant opportunity, not only in terms of biodiversity and nature, but economic. And you think about what New Zealand could look like and should look like in 2040, with the abundant amount of renewable energy, with using that energy to drive industry both domestically, but also exporting energy. New Zealand becomes a very powerful player in that global stage, because actually our proximity and our distance, actually in an unstable geopolitical environment, is a massive advantage as well. And so I just think, I'm excited about what's forward. I think the frameworks that we've got working here give us the riverbanks in terms of where we're playing. I think we do need to be cognitive of the fact that many investors are in Australia and New Zealand and other countries, so they want a sort of common playing field, because New Zealand might be too hard, because we're not sure. So there is a little bit of that, but I'm confident we're working through that. But I think the key is we need to actually start converting some of these ideas to actually implementable action. Start writing some of these deals, and that will then flow through in all of other sectors in terms of confidence, infrastructure, workforce, and actually economic growth. Which how do we need that with the current challenges we have around deficits, both operationally but also in the capital space?
Can I just jump in? I think the comments you make about where government steps in, where it steps out, I think is really good. I think there's a real important need right now of a government or a view across and above and a strategic lens, both in terms of across traditional kind of operating sectors or whatnot, but also temporally. And you kind of made that point about climate change appearing in 5, 10, 50, 100 plus years. And there needs to be that role of government to look really far ahead about what is necessary in the future and what are the things we need to do now. The adaptation focus is great. Nature, fundamentally, I think that point about drawing that in is critical. But we can't lose the fact that some of those adaptation measures don't sit separate from mitigation. So one of the key lessons from our transport sector scenarios was, we talk about roading, we talk about building out roads, but that has a real adaptation implication, right? If we build a more diffuse and distributed network, that's more exposed to those climate impacts. So thinking differently about how we move around isn't just a decarbonisation play, it's actually a future asset play, that if we already know we have an infrastructure deficit or a funding deficit, if we build more and more distributed networks, that becomes harder and harder to maintain levels of service. So we need to think about that integration point and having government look across everything whilst businesses kind of go and try and beaver away and do their specific activities is a really important role, right?
We've got a number of questions coming in, and they sort of relate to this theme of, how do we drive actual investment and deliver on these outcomes? There is no shortage of opportunities and capital, and taking a 20, 30-year view, looking at KiwiSaver, for example, the pot of capital that sits there. I'm assuming there is a number of conversations with Minister Bailey about how do we sort of get the right settings in that. Helen, I guess interested in maybe a contribution from yourself. You mentioned that you do sit around and you look at these things and want to be doing more. What do you see as sort of the handbrakes or the things that kind of put up the barriers at the moment to be able to execute on that? Is it more lead from the government in terms of creating opportunities, or is it regulatory reporting challenges?
I think, there's no actual legal issue behind doing it. I think we did a huge piece of work with Toitū Tahua, the Sustainable Finance Centre, on this and how you can get more investment into it. I think there's a bit of an education plan going on with some investment elements. I think also we have a tendency to look at KiwiSaver. It is a great unit in its own right, but it's also something that has a transferable option and its own limitations on the fact that you have to effectively keep liquidity in order to be able to facilitate those transfers. And also it's not a compulsory measure. And there is a huge amount that sits outside of that within private wealth, for instance, that we don't talk about at the moment, and how do you get those guys into more of an infrastructure arrangement. So I think there's many different pillars in this, and we have a tendency to talk about this very generally. There's also, why isn't the investment community investing more into New Zealand? Our primary focus is, of course, investing for our members, and we need to do what's best for our members, and sometimes having all your eggs in one basket isn't the best thing for them. So we're always balancing that a little bit, but I think, there's an excellent report that's come out from Toitū on that.
Looking at one of the things, I just want to continue to sort of on the regime itself, obviously looking ahead to assurance and sort of looking at what else we could be facing when we look at other international standards. Some of the questions in here, looking at Australia's climate disclosure regime, capturing many more entities than New Zealand. We've talked about the scope sort of remaining relatively stable for a period of time, but what do we see coming ahead, or what do you look at on the radar that sort of keeps you awake around the assurance regime and what standards are happening and evolving overseas?
If I was a smaller player in the market, I think I would be probably would have taken up a lot of the first-time adoption provisions, and I would be definitely staying awake thinking about audit. Because we have gone through an audit process, and we've done this before. Obviously, you officially really have to, but we've gone through that process, and we've gone through a learning process with the auditors on this as well. But for instance, there is a materiality threshold of the amount of incorrect data or stale data you can have within your audits. And that means that we've had to have a person sitting there Googling companies to check whether there has been a more relevant emission number or finance number come through in order to make sure that we don't breach those materiality thresholds. That is a human cost there, and it's because, in part, because the data providers don't audit their own data at the moment. So the good thing about Australia coming on board is that there is a much greater global voice to encourage that to happen, so that it sits with the central database, but that is going to be quite challenging. And when you think about particularly in the investment market in New Zealand, there's probably 5-6 players out there that have more than one person looking at sustainability. And sometimes most of those it's half a head count, and let's face it, most of it there's a gender element in this as well, so not always the greatest voice at the table. So I think that's going to be quite a challenge for some of the smaller players, and congratulations on hitting your milestone, because in one more year's time you're going to be thinking about this.
It'll be solved by then, I'm sure.
But it's a really big issue, and I think that the data issue is going to be huge, and the cost involved with getting that data, enormous. So, what are we creating by doing this? And even on the banks and insurance side, banks and insurers are going out and building data sets. They're going out and surveying and finding out this information and trying to find out, we're down to almost a business banking level, what's the emissions that are coming out of it? Are we creating our own industry going on there, and how can we make sure that that's done in a much more efficient way? So.
Perhaps a role for government in the data space.
But it's a global issue. Maybe in New Zealand. Yeah, 100%.
You might not say, but government aren't too good at data in many ways, so I wouldn't count your chicken there.
Can I allay a fear that's probably in the room? The External Reporting Board, although I said, you've got to comply, the legal requirements are NZCS, and that's a regulatory stable position for the moment. We are investing huge amounts of time and effort into keeping up to date with exactly what's going on in many regimes. In fact, we've got 3 of our team working with the Australians. Actually, I don't know if I can say this out loud because I'm not sure I'm allowed to second staff, but I've seconded them to the Australian government. We've got three of the team working with the Australians, making sure that we understand what they're doing and they understand the experiences that we gained, and trying to talk and bring to their table your experiences about the practical implications and the practical challenges. Harmonisation and being relevant and being part of the international stage, the External Reporting Board understands fully. But I think you already know New Zealand went first. We had to issue our standards ahead of the ISSB. Their standards didn't exist at the time. We're all based on TCFD. So there is already a big base of interoperability. That's the new buzzword. There are differences. They've got 50 more disclosures. We've got about 10 things that are in our standard that are not in theirs. And we will undertake in 2025 post-implementation review. You'll have only done your first reports. Maybe you've started your second, and we'll be going on, knocking on the door saying, right, what changes do we need to make this both internationally aligned but still locally relevant and suitable for the size and shape of the New Zealand market. So rest assured, we are very, very focused on the international challenge, but you don't want us changing this every 5 minutes. It's a heavy enough lift as it is. But we will wait for the Australians to settle. Maybe we'll have the law in place there by August, maybe a standard close to December. Don't know, they have to wait for their law to pass before they're even allowed to issue a standard. On the assurance front, let's not wish that mandatory assurance in too soon. I encourage you to undertake voluntary.
Can I just add 2 things on resourcing really quickly? Mm-hmm. One, that point about sitting, and I've sat in sustainability teams for a long time. The critical thing we need to get to is that this doesn't just sit on its own as a process that sits in isolation, and getting it across a range of different folk within the organisation and involvement is really, really important about where we need to go. Obviously, there's a technical bit at the moment, integrating an education point, which we've highlighted.
That assumes you've got a lot of people in your business to get across as well.
The second thing I would say, though, is just on that kind of where do we want to get to and what do we need to do? We have this potential self-enforcing compliance spiral that will sit down. If we don't have the right people in the room participating in this, we're not going to get the insights that we need to move forward, and we won't see the value, and then we won't get investment. So if we don't put the right amount of effort in at the front end, have the right people involved, we're not going to see the value, and then we're not going to get engagement further on, right?
And I think this is probably going to be one of the key balancing acts that we're going to have as a sector going forward, because if you look at some of the things coming out of, say, European Union, you're starting to have solutions now designed by the Risk and Compliance Committee rather than actually being built by investment experts and delivering on the outcomes. And so there's going to be a real balance here to strike to ensure that while we become very conscious of regulatory oversight, not wanting to misstep, that we are actually still delivering great solutions to the market. So, I think that's going to be a fine balancing act. Look, conscious of time, but sort of want to maybe just touch on briefly some of the questions coming in. We're touching on nature and biodiversity and sort of looking ahead to where that's going to come into play. It is a critical element, and I think it's much more understood from a consumer perspective as well. So maybe interested in the panel's thoughts generally around how you see this evolving into your respective product solutions and the regulatory regime, obviously as a pillar going forward as well. Minister.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just kick off. I mean, at the moment, in terms of emissions removals, forestry is the only participant in that aspect that gains, in effect, working capital through the ETS. Our view is that actually, from an outcomes point of view of reducing emissions, we're agnostic to what removes carbon. If it's validated, accredited, and is scientifically verified, then whether it's blue carbon or it's CCUS or it's looking at other technology options that are out there, if it can, or natives in terms of the biodiversity element within our large conservation estate, if that can be validated, then we should be able to provide a mechanism in which provides a degree of credit through that. The question really is what's the mechanism to provide that credit? And I'm currently seeking advice around that. It could be part of the ETS, or it could be a separate aspect around a biodiversity credit, which is in play in other jurisdictions. But we need a framework that doesn't pick the winners, because the climate and our biodiversity doesn't pick winners, it just wants the outcome. And we need to think about the lowest cost pathway as well, from an economic sense as well. So that's the work that we've got underway. We'll have that in our emissions reduction plan in terms of a signal to the market that that's where we're heading and we're doing that. And I expect probably early part of next year we'll have some tangible policy around that. I'm working together with the agricultural ministers, environment minister and myself are all working together as a team to look at this problem statement. And so you can have confidence that we're looking at this from multiple perspectives, which ensures that we get the solutions to what are quite challenging things. But when we come up with a solution, it's enduring and it's sustainable, i.e. it's not going to flip-flop. So,
Well, look, I'm conscious of time for everybody and appreciate the panel's contribution to hopefully being sort of a robust discussion around the regime and where we're going. I'll sort of reflect on the comments from Kenny this morning and sort of the conversations that we had clearly with Jane Goodall around there is hope, ultimately. And I think right now, particularly in the mix of the last few years and the pace of change, we need to keep an eye on that sort of future outcome and be optimistic about where we're going as a sector. And there is no shortage of desire or capital here to create, as you touched on, Minister, transformational change. And so now it's about making sure we've got those collaborations and open dialogue to deliver outcomes for Kiwis. So thank you all for your contribution and thank you for joining us this morning.
thank you.